Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair, and today I have the honor of hosting Dr. Tanvi Madan with me, who is director of the India Project and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She has authored a wonderful book, Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, which is a great historical take. I haven't fully read the book. I've read excerpts of it, and it is a must read, even though I've not fully digested the book yet. And she also recently authored a paper titled Major Power Rivalry in South Asia. It's a discussion paper that takes a look at what's going on in the region and how this emerging US-China rivalry, what's going on with India and China, what the Chinese are trying to do with the BRI and other regional powers in South Asia, what the implications of all of this are. So I figured that today we sort of step away from our internal lens at Pakistan and look at the region more broadly. And the links to both the book and the paper are in the description below, and I highly recommend that you do check it out. So, Dr. Tanvi, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Pakistanomy.
Thanks so much, Uzair. It's great to be on the podcast.
I want to start with your CFR publication, and as I was reading it, one thing that struck to me, and of course, there's been a lot of conversation around what's going on in South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean. You write, quote, that this will be a significant arena of major power competition, end quote, in the coming years. Of course, a lot of the audience for this podcast is based in Pakistan and in India. Some 40% of the listeners are Indian. So perhaps start by sketching sort of a map of why you believe this area, this competition is emerging in this arena, and what are the broader implications of this?
So I think one of the things that the report, in fact, the starting point of the report is to kind of point out that this is going to, this kind of major power competition and these rivalries are going to look very different or mean different things for countries in the region, including India and Pakistan, than the Cold War did and US-Soviet competition did. And the report makes the point that during the Cold War, yes, Pakistan was a US ally. India, kind of was non-aligned and played one off against the other. But largely, especially for most of the Cold War, I think the one exception was the developments in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion in 1979. But otherwise, South Asia was considered fairly kind of secondary as an arena, if not tertiary, of an arena of competition. Some of your listeners might remember, and you might remember, that Robert McMahon wrote a great book called Cold War, about the Cold War in South Asia. And it was called, and the kind of subtitle was Cold War on the Periphery. I think that actually was the title. And, that told you kind of where the kind of focus was. And, initially in the Cold War, it was Europe, and then it was kind of East Asia for other chunks when Asia did come into kind of focus. What you're seeing today, and I argue that makes this kind of different and will require, I think we can talk about some similarities I think you'll see from the Cold War that I think India and Pakistan will be familiar to India and Pakistan, and they can even try some of the same tactics. But I think as the landscape and kind of where the focus areas is, I argue that this competitive era is going to be different for the region. And the reason I say that is because, for one, and I've been asked by others, by the way, why didn't you look at India, Pakistan more deeply? And it's partly because I was given, like I said, okay, this is major power rivalry in South Asia. Who do you consider major powers and whose rivalries? And so, I was given a list. It was US, India, China, Russia, Europe, and yours, as a whole, but I could look at European countries, potentially Japan as well. And so kind of stepping back again, I think, if you look at the two major power rivalries that will affect this region, and there will be others, but the two that will affect them are China, India, and US-China rivalries. And what I say in the paper and show is that one of those two rivalries is taking place in South Asia itself, or in the Indo-Pacific, or in the kind of Indian Ocean region. And so this is not a competition that's outside and will shape the region. It is happening in the region. And it is happening at a time when China-India competition is intensifying around the region as well. And different countries other than those two are very much part of the battleground, so to speak, when Beijing and Delhi think about this competition. I think a second reason why is that if you think about even US-China competition, you're already seeing the Indo-Pacific broadly, of which South Asia and the Indian Ocean region form a part, already is a key arena of competition. So it doesn't even have to be argued. You're seeing it all around, whether it's in terms of connectivity, whether it's in terms of kind of influence, whether it's in terms of kind of geopolitical or military access. And so I think you are seeing already this region be an arena for competition. And the other thing is that one of the two countries that is involved now, when the US and Soviet Union were facing off, both were kind of distant powers. I mean, Soviet Union wasn't that far, but they were relatively distant powers. What you're seeing today is at least one of those two main antagonists, it is at South Asia's doorstep, and particularly at India's doorstep. And you're seeing China now more active than ever before in pretty much every region, every country in South Asia, and increasingly making forays into the Indian Ocean region. And so I think for those reasons, you are going to see the impact. And then you could add the technology, the kind of global telecom, technology standards, etc. So this is kind of a standards competition, a rules competition. Is playing out in international institutions. And I think, South Asian countries will also be seen as countries to woo or deter in these various spaces. I think the other thing and I think one of the implications will be is that this is not something the smaller South Asian states can necessarily say we will sit away from. So I think where we will see similarity is that the countries other than US, China, India, and some of the other major powers in the region, which we can talk about, will actually try to do what smaller states did, including smaller states like or kind of non-US Soviet countries like India and like Pakistan during the Cold War, which is that they will try to play one off against the other to try to elicit as many benefits as they can and try to kind of minimize the risks or at least insulate themselves from the worst of the crises. But I think there is a warning there as well. If there is crisis, it spills over. It will spill over, I think, for everybody's interests.
You mentioned one thing that, there's similarities with what happened in the Cold War, particularly with India sort of being non-aligned, but closer to the USSR, particularly in terms of, the military assistance it got and everything else. Many in Pakistan increasingly now believe that India is firmly in the American camp. And the Pakistanis are sort of talking and looking back at history and saying, well, we should have done what India did in the Cold War, which is play off these sides against each other to get what it wanted. And we don't want to be clubbed into the China camp, right? There's this emerging discourse in Pakistan. How do you see that playing out? And one, do you agree with this perspective, at least from the Pakistani lens, that India is fully in the American camp, so to speak, with the Quad and everything else? And two, is it going to be as simple as bargaining the way it happened in the Cold War, or is it like going to be much, much trickier given everything else that's changed in the world?
So that's giving Ayub Khan far too little credit, I think, because it's in some ways it's people joke in India the exact opposite. Pakistan managed to have its cake and eat it too during the Cold War. And if you actually look at what Ayub did, and it is interesting, just like you saw kind of a decade or so later, and actually 2 decades later, Zulfikar Bhutto learned, for example, on the domestic politics side, pick up tips from kind of Indira Gandhi's campaigns, the Roti Kapra Makan thing. You did actually see some learning. And so what you saw is, even in the Cold War, you saw Ayub and Zulfikar Bhutto arguing for this too as foreign minister, to actually, even while being a US ally, to deepen relations with China and eventually the Soviet Union, but particularly China. So when China and Pakistan relations start developing in the early 60s, and especially when the border deal that was signed in '63. At that time, the U.S. was very much still an a Pakistani ally, and you heard this frustration from Presidents kind of Kennedy and first Eisenhower, then Kennedy, then Johnson, and President Johnson in very blunt terms, where he said, how is Pakistan getting away with this? That they are allies, and they are hanging out with our main kind of rivals, particularly as the Vietnam War was unfolding. So I would just say that one of the things is I actually think Pakistan managed to be non-aligned and aligned at the same time in some ways, or at least as an ally did still find ways to play one off against the other. Late '60s even managed to get military equipment from the USSR. But I do think today, what you're going to see in terms of kind of India's position, and I recently wrote a War on the Rocks piece on this, and did some of the kind of more Cold War comparison for a Washington Quarterly piece last year. But I mean, both make the point that this US-China competition for India, it is not going to walk a middle path or sit on the fence or sit on the sidelines. Not just because geographically it is taking place within the region, or because the distribution of power is different and India is kind of one of the major powers that can't really sit these things out. But most significantly, because India's relationship with the two antagonists is very different from what it was with the US and Soviet Union. So with the US and Soviet Union, India could play one off against the other. It was important to both those countries as a kind of swing state. And it had no major disputes, fundamental bilateral disputes. Differences, yes, but no major disputes. Today, if you look at the competition, in one corner, you have India's closest partner, arguably, the US. And in another corner, you have China, India's main rival, alone in conjunction as India sees it with Pakistan. So in that sense, when even Nehru said there's no non-alignment vis-a-vis China, but I think, you've seen when India has aligned in the past. It has been first in the '60s with the US, and then in the '70s with the Soviet Union. Both times were to balance China, and I think you're seeing that again, where when it comes to an external security challenge, one that India has recognized that it cannot tackle on its own, with a large capabilities gap that the report mentions. 30 years ago, China-India economies were the same size, about the same size. Today, China's economy is 5 times that of India. So I think India recognizes it needs partners, and China and the US and India are aligned on particularly perceptions about concerns about China, and largely on the approach to take towards tackling those concerns. And so I think you are seeing India making choices that will often align with the US and other kind of its allies, like-minded allies, but not always. And how the US and India handle those times that they do have differences, I think will help determine how far and fast the US and India can cooperate together. So I don't think India is going to kind of join a bloc, so to speak, but I think the decisions it makes will largely kind of align with those of the US, particularly vis-a-vis China.
So I think one thing that you're absolutely right, that the Soviet-US rivalry was distant even in the broader South Asian context. It changed, for example, for Pakistan fundamentally when the invasion of Afghanistan happened. But in this particular case, the core issue, so to speak, between at least the India-China rivalry is the boundary dispute in the north. And we've seen over the last few months, conflict break out, so to speak, in the northern border regions. Indian military leaders have talked about the fears of a 2.5 front war or a 2-front war emerge or re-emerge, so to speak. We've seen in many historical examples that such disputes in the middle of a rivalry often lead to conflict, broader conflict. And there's been some talk about resolving this if talks haven't moved forward. How do you see this dispute progressing given this rivalry and given the intensification of this broader geopolitical rivalry between the US and China and in India, sort of looking at that as well, particularly in the context of what we've seen in both China and in India, but broader region and globally, it's a phenomenon, is rising nationalism, right? So Xi Jinping represents a rising China. Prime Minister Modi represents India that is more muscular in its approach. How do all of these things play out, given that the core issue is a boundary dispute and their neighbors, and they've actually started to come to blows again?
And it's quite interesting, especially talking about this in the context of also kind of India-Pakistan ties, which is, if you actually think about it, for China and India have had this kind of, it is the longest undemarcated boundary in the world. And yet, compared to the LOC, the line of control, the line of actual control, and the kind of broader undemarcated boundary between China and India had been relatively calm. And particularly, I think you saw after the 1988 boundary dispute boundary incidents between China and India, it was relatively calm. And part of the reason is that there was a process there of dialogue, mechanisms, etc., that had been set up, a series of agreements on the China-India side, which between, I think, 1993 and 20, I can't remember, the last one was signed in 2012 or 2013, but you saw those sets of agreements, those 5 agreements and kind of sub-agreements within that laid out a way to manage the boundary dispute. It created some mechanism for the two countries to start talking about resolving the boundary dispute, because they have competing claims. But the bigger focus in some ways was, we will manage the boundary dispute through these various mechanisms, agreements, protocols, including, not joint patrolling, but both sides patrolling in certain areas, not carrying loaded weapons, for example, rules of engagement that were designed not to be escalatory. So compared to kind of the constant firing across the LOC, you actually saw a fairly calm boundary, or relatively calm boundary for years. And the reason I mentioned those agreements is related to the question of, can this be resolved? I think those agreements, from India's perspective, and what those agreements did is, those agreements helped open the door to the broader development of a broader China-India relationship, whether it was developing economic ties, whether it was their cooperation on many global governance issues, including trade, including climate change, including asking for greater representation in global economic governance institutions. And you did see that those agreements both maintain stability at the boundary, and then consequently create the space for the relationship to move forward. The reason what you saw is kind of a change after Xi Jinping came to power. And we don't know if it's because Xi Jinping came to power, or because it just also so happens that these positions around the boundary are to both sides now more accessible because of infrastructure building than they used to be. So they're bumping up against each other a lot more. And so some have argued, well, the agreements weren't built to kind of withstand that. Others say, no, that's not the case.
And sorry to interrupt, but some would even argue that this was all part of a masterful Chinese grand strategy of biding their time, and now that they have the capacity to push the boundaries as much as they can, given that they have the power.
That's absolutely right. And that one question is, well, for example, the boundary crisis last year in particular, with the Chinese moves at the border, because we did see this as part of a broader kind of Chinese assertiveness around its neighborhood. But it is interesting because, I am skeptical of China as a 9-foot tall or 12-foot tall playing 9-dimensional chess grand strategist, because to me, I don't know, call me old-fashioned, but any strategy that, yes, it is about your domestic imperatives, but manages to upset pretty much all your major neighbors in a significant way is probably not all that grand. So maybe a strategy, maybe for your domestic audience, but you're right. I think there is this question: what has been, why has this happened? But given that this is the 4th major military standoff since kind of Xi Jinping came to power, and fundamentally different, and the reason it is different and harder to resolve this particular crisis is, and one can hope that it is at least stabilized. And so the good thing about the agreements is that they allowed for or created the mechanisms that the two countries have been using to ensure that this doesn't go even further out of control. Mechanisms that don't exist in the India-Pakistan case in many cases. They are obviously mechanisms, but you have seen on the India-China side, the very mechanisms that are now under great strain, they are nonetheless useful in terms of making sure there hasn't been further escalation or crisis communication, etc., is possible. And so I think what you have seen is that those mechanisms have been useful. They are being used to potentially at least try to stabilize the relationship. This is where India and China are negotiating, is in some of these groups, particularly the kind of military dialogue mechanisms. But at the same time, from the Indian perspective, they see what happened last year as China, and the government will say attempting to change the status quo. Most people will say has changed the status quo at the boundary. The way the recent Pentagon China military power report put it was Chinese incursions. And what you saw is that I haven't seen this kind of consensus across India's China watching community and China hands, where pretty much every major, you didn't hear too many of the sitting officials say things publicly, but you saw almost every former Indian ambassador to China or former kind of foreign secretary who's been a China specialist say one thing, talk about this as being fundamentally different, talk about this as being a violation of the boundary agreements. That is something the Indian government has said as well. Now, why is that important? It's because you might be able to stabilize the boundary agreement, about boundary situation, if China, for example, either we have a new kind of normal, that this is what it is, or China might actually decide, okay, that piece of land we grabbed is just not worth this, and decide to kind of de-escalate or disengage from the forward deployment at least. But I think what you will see, or at least those positions, I think what you won't see is going back to where we were in terms of the broader relationship or even deployments at the border. And that is because of this sense in India that the boundary agreements were violated. Because the sense now is, how do we know that China won't do this again? How do we trust that, we have these agreements that the moment we let our guard down, and I think it was particularly grating to India that this took advantage of Indian exercises not taking place due to COVID. And so China saw that as a window of opportunity. And so I think that lack of trust is going to mean we're seeing now a second straight winter where the troops will remain forward deployed. And I think as long as there's a lack of trust, and I don't see anything that will resolve that, you can see a stabilizing of the situation at the boundary. We can hopefully see no further escalation. But I find it hard to believe that you will see a return to status quo ante in the relationship, even if you see it at the boundary, because I think there is not going to be trust that agreements. And so I think what you will see is forward deployed troops. So I don't think the LAC will look exactly like the LOC, but it'll look a lot more like the LOC, hopefully without the constant firing and ceasefire violations. But I do think you will see a more militarized boundary. And you're already seeing, and the longer this continues, India and China are taking steps that will solidify the actions they've taken in terms of domestic policies. So India imposing restrictions and extra scrutiny and a range of Chinese involvement in various sectors. And doubling down on India, for example, doubling down on partnerships with the US, France, Japan, even maintaining its relationship with Russia, and China doing things like their new land boundary law, etc. So I think the longer this continues, the more we see the solidify. So I think this is really going to be about managing competition rather than kind of resolving the disputes. That was hard even before, and I think it's become much, much harder today.
How do you rate then, given, so, obviously the economic sort of gap between China and India is huge, but India has historically had pretty decent relations in the broader region, so to speak. It's also kind of made efforts to improve relations with Bangladesh over the last few years, although some volatility here and there keeps emerging. How do you see India's sort of broader regional strategy in South Asia as a means to sort of push back or restrain growing Chinese influence? I mean, I was just reading up on the fact that we had the Durga Puja riots in Bangladesh, and part of the sort of, in so many words, criticism from the Sheikh Hasina government came was that i.e. Indian government's position on these things, or what they say in political speeches, is not helping the situation. And we saw what happened in Tripura after that. So given sort of this encroaching of China in the broader South Asian region, how do you see India's role in its relations with its close neighbors to say, what, that might actually be a good way to push back against the Chinese as well?
So I think, my colleague Constantino Xavier writes a fair bit about this in terms of India's neighborhood strategy. I think multiple Indian prime ministers have had a similar view that India can do best if it takes the region along, and if it has good relations and cooperative relations. Now, this is translated in different ways. So sometimes you've seen kind of a heavy-handed India, which, like most big countries and regions, in the hegemon, in the academic sense, which is you want your preferences to shape their choices.
Well, it's funny in that sense, like, given that, I often talk to Pakistanis about this, and they say, well, the Indians complain about China sort of being the hegemon and pushing everybody around because of its size. Well, look what India does in the region itself, given its size and hegemonic attitude.
Well, and you heard this from Afghans about Pakistan as well, right? So you always see this in when there's this kind of capabilities issue, and China then complains about this about the U.S. So I think but the thing is, for the smaller states, they don't necessarily mind as what Constantino Xavier has called like a more competitive South Asian region, because they will now do what India did during the Cold War. You're going to play one off against the other to derive benefits. And so you've seen this with Bangladesh, you've seen this with Nepal, you've seen this with Sri Lanka, you've seen this with the Maldives as well. Now you do also see this, and I'll come to this, because I think this is where you can see sometimes kind of major power rivalries end up being destabilizing politically within these countries as well, because they use competition, or these different countries will support different political parties, or will look the other way while, for example, you're not having a free and open election because you don't want to say anything about democracy or human rights that will upset that country and push them towards China. And so you will, or it'll prevent, for example, China and the US and everybody who might be concerned, for example, about Afghanistan and stability there, you might take different actions because you think the other guy will undercut you, or you would rather preserve your space there rather than ensure that a government is more inclusive. So I do think, this is another place this will interact, but I think for India, the challenge is because it has gone from being, speaking in economic terms, from having a monopoly in the region or near monopoly to now having to deal with kind of a more free market, or at least a more competitive space where countries have choices. It means India has to up its game. It also means India is, and you've already seen this, and whether it's in terms of delivering on its connectivity projects, which it has many, delivering on assistance, upping its game in terms of both soft power and military economic assistance, capacity building, making it easier for students, for example, from these countries to go to India, encouraging this sense, and working with these countries to ensure that their priorities, because many of these countries welcome China into the region. They feel China is giving infrastructure that is quick, and especially for politicians running for elections, that is important, amongst other things that China brings to the table, more parochially for them. So I think for India, the challenge really is in a more competitive space, dealing now in a situation where it might have problems with growing Chinese influence. And I think India has a bigger problem with the influence than the kind of economic activities. And worrying that what China will do is use that influence to say to these countries, don't do X, Y, or Z with India or with Japan or with the US. So I think India just has to kind of deliver. At the end of the day, it is the country that borders all the other South Asian countries. And so the idea is, I think you'll see a mixture of carrot and sticks, but I think India will find that the sticks are sometimes less effective, and they'll have to be more in the terms of red lines that are not as aggressive as they might have been in the past. But really kind of that positive offer has to be that kind of, what are the advantages you get? And so I think it'll have to up its game. And I think one thing India is recognizing, you've already seen this change, is that India, which had a kind of Monroe Doctrine sort of thing, Indira Doctrine, I guess, for the Indian context, which wasn't really happy with external powers being operational in the region. The one time we saw, sometimes that we saw exceptions to this, is when India started worrying about China. And we saw this in the 50s in Nepal, which I talk about in my book. And at that time, and you're seeing it again, when India worries that China is coming into the neighborhood and it cannot tackle and make the kind of offers, economic, others, it will either look the other way when US, Japan, France, Britain, others are dealing with these countries, like-minded, even Russia. And in some cases, we'll even actively cooperate with them to work together. So India, Japan working together on connectivity projects, or hoping to in Sri Lanka. Sheikh Hasina is in France right now. In the olden days, and I suspect some of the kind of retired diplomats in India will kind of look askance at that. But I think from India's perspective, would they rather that Sheikh Hasina buy even more military equipment from the Chinese, or would they rather she buy it from France or Russia? And then I think you saw this in, for example, when the US and Maldives signed a defense agreement last year, the year before, I think it was last year. You saw India, which in any other time would have objected to that, actually welcomed that agreement. So I think you have already seen change, but it's incumbent upon India to deliver. And I think second, on the points you were saying, it's Indian domestic politics, especially kind of because of the way that, South Asia has, is ethnically kind of situated, but how the lines were drawn, is you always have kind of the country next door. There's the politics spills over into neighboring states. We've seen this in Assam and Bengal with Bangladesh. We've seen this in kind of UP with Nepal, and then and Bihar as well. And then you've seen this, you've traditionally seen this in Tamil Nadu with Sri Lanka. And so I think the Indian government would do well to ensure that this kind of spillover it doesn't take place, and that that not making the mistake that China does, which is you're so kind of focused on your domestic political imperatives that you end up damaging your relationships with the very countries you need for strategic reasons in your neighborhood.
I think you mentioned Bangladesh and Sheikh Hasina being in France. I don't know what you think about this, but to me, when I look at sort of the broader subcontinent, not South Asia writ large, the foreign policy and economic policy her administration has sort of navigated through has been masterful, right? So you look at the Japanese have some projects, the Chinese get a little bit of something. With India, they've made progress and have strategic relations that are deepening day and day, with electricity and things like that. And then obviously with the Americans and the Europeans, obviously it's a big market for them. And you mentioned the fact that how countries in this competitive environment will try to get the best deal for themselves. Bangladesh has done really, really well, at least so far, and it remains to be seen how they navigate that. Which then brings me to sort of the Indo-Pacific, right? And like the role of the UK, France, Australia, Japan, the Quad, so to speak, broadly speaking. One, do you see the sort of Chinese aggression in the north on the boundary sort of a premeditated bid to sort of tie up India in the Himalayas so that it doesn't pay attention to the ocean, particularly because of the economic gap and the fact that there's a resource constraint? And B, if that is the case, or if it isn't, would love to talk to you about that. But B, how do you see then these relationships shaping up in the Indo-Pacific, given sort of the fallout or the Australia submarine deal and the French having a different point of view on that? And then broadly speaking, where the Quad is headed?
So I think, it's an interesting question what the Chinese were thinking or not thinking. And, I will say in our field, many of us don't say, I don't know too often, but I think this is genuinely the case. We're still arguing about Chinese motivations and from the 1962 war. And so I think we will be arguing about their motivations, and you've seen kind of many explanations for their moves last year. So I don't know kind of I think strategically, it has been the case, for example, that the Chinese motivations for a relationship with Pakistan are partly about tying India down in South Asia. So from a strategic perspective, I think anything that does make India a less, less potent kind of, from China's perspective, rival or threat, any kind of strategist would take that move. I think the particular steps at the boundary last year, this kind of salami slicing tactics, I don't know. I think in hindsight, we're saying, oh, it might distract India from the kind of maritime space. I'm not sure that was, I think we don't have sufficient evidence to back that. I think, where we find the most plausible kind of explanations are of the view that, either, as you were indicating, was part of this kind of broader Chinese assertiveness where they saw a window of opportunity at that particular time, and they're feeling more confident. Another version of that is the regime was feeling insecure given their initial handling of COVID and wanted to show strength and show that they could protect sovereignty. And it could be as simple as they said, let's grab these pieces of land that we think, territory that we think we should have. And they might have underestimated the Indian response. Don't ask me why, because India in the last 4 or 5 boundary crises, or actually consistently since 1967 or so, has always reacted the same way, which is, you move troops up front and then you try to reverse the Chinese steps. But I think we'll be debating that. I think, the question, yes, there are finite resources that India has. But so, as Foreign Minister Jaishankar said, India just has to walk and chew gum at the same time. And he was saying that in the reference to, can you handle the fallout from Afghanistan and also kind of handle the challenge from China? But it's the same case with the maritime space. But it does have an impact. I mean, I think because of the resources. And you see this in terms of the military budget and, the defense budget and how much the Navy gets. Having said that, I think it is also why you're seeing India willing to partner with like-minded countries, and goes that to a question of, how India views things like AUKUS. Because India has this multifaceted challenge, and China is not just kind of at the land boundary, coming into maritime space, in the digital space, in the communication space, that you are seeing in India say, we need partners. And we need to double down on partners. And it has also, I think, fundamentally changed how India sees American power and presence in the region. When I was growing up in India in the 80s, the US was considered the country that was trying to contain India's rise, that was problematic. And, whether it was Indira Gandhi or others, it was like, the US shouldn't come to the region. It's, any moves by these powers, it's destabilizing. Today, you see this very different picture. India actually worries about US withdrawing from the region, whether that's from Afghanistan or whether that would be, as if the Trump administration is going to leave the Indo-Pacific. And so today, India thinks of American power not as the problem. It sees American power as part of the solution to its own China problem. And it sees the American presence in the region as helpful, including in the Indian Ocean, where India is actively working with the US. And it is seeing it not just as helpful, but as potentially essential. And so it sees, I think, AUKUS partly from this prism, where if AUKUS is, for India, AUKUS at best is a reflection of US commitment to the region, or additional kind of showing a demonstration of resolve, particularly vis-a-vis China. It is a kind of reflection of the Australian changed view about China and willingness to do something about it. And in both these ways, it's aligned with India. And it has the added benefit of, I think from Indian minds, the hope that the UK's new tilt to the Indo-Pacific is actually being implemented and will come with a better British understanding of the challenge that China poses, because they think the Brits have kind of, to some extent been somewhat non-aligned or tried to hedge or try to play one off against the other. And so I think you've seen India not, when they've been asked, is this a problem in terms of the Quad? You've seen officials say, nope, that's different. I think where India would have liked to see something better, which is the better handling of the announcement, because the last thing they want to see is, their partners pulling in different directions. And so for them, France is also an important partner. And they had an Australia-India-France trilateral that was moving along quite quickly, particularly maritime security. And that's essentially, at least stalled for now. And so I think India would have liked to have seen that handled better. Having said that, National Security Advisor Doval was in France recently for the strategic dialogue to meet with his counterparts, as well as the foreign and defense ministers there. And you saw Foreign Minister Jaishankar meet his counterpart in New York, I think. And I think you saw, India will see how it can take advantage of the France and French being unhappy. As for the Quad, I think, the India has clearly changed its mind about how much to commit itself to the Quad, and it clearly has. This time last year, it wouldn't even use the word Quad in statements, and now you've seen significant development. And I think you'll see kind of two lines of effort with the Quad, which is one kind of in a more traditional balance of power way, which is also what AUKUS is doing at a kind of higher scale or more intense scale. And that's, working with these countries to shape a favorable balance of power, to deter China. And then I think second, you're seeing a whole range of activities, which we hear more about, to build resilience in the region, to offer alternatives, to help these countries also kind of detect, deter, and then defend against challenges, whether that is Chinese coercion, whether that is COVID, whether that's climate change. And I think that part and the emphasis on that building resilience part partly comes from hearing from the region. Again, going back to smaller states have agency and have some power that they can deploy, which is hearing from the region that, we want you to do things that are helpful to us. Otherwise, you guys are going to, play these power games, and that is either irrelevant to our needs or it is actively harmful. And so even though China is doing actively harmful things to us, it's also giving us this infrastructure and other things that's useful in the short term. So what are you bringing to the table? So I think that building resilience part is partly about bringing forward, regional solutions to, and tangible solutions to regional problems.
So one thing where you conclude this sort of paper is sort of, I would say on a hopeful note, but it's also maybe posed as a question towards the end, is, there are opportunities for cooperation in the middle of this rivalry that is emerging and going to dominate South Asia. Obviously, where we are today with the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan, the Taliban government coming in, no inkling of dialogue between India and Pakistan, the boundary dispute in the north we've talked at length about. From your point of view, what are these areas of cooperation, if any? And how would you then, if you were to put your hat on and sort of fast forward 5-10 years from now, say that, what, we had this moment of rivalry in the region, and rather than descend into conflict and more chaos that, this region has seen for at least 7 decades, if not more, maybe we came out better as a more integrated, as a more connected, community in this region. How does that happen, if at all?
Uzair, I hope you're not overselling the optimism in the report to...
No, I'm not. I am actually making it be more optimistic in that sense.
I think we need more kind of optimism in the field. I was thinking the other day, we should end every kind of meeting or event with what good news can somebody share today? I do think, especially for even in the Cold War, you actually saw competition in some ways. It was very disruptive, superpower competition for, so I'll do this in 2 ways. One is there's scope for cooperation between the rivals, particularly kind of India, China, because I think there's a lot out there on US, China, and we could be here for the rest of the week. But I'll first talk about kind of the opportunity for smaller states. I think, what you saw, and actually India did this masterfully in some ways. Indian analysts would often say, oh, the Cold War prevented us from, was a distraction. It was, there were so many more important things. But one question I have and can't answer, it's a counterfactual. But part of what the Cold War did is it actually gave India importance. And India used it to then get development assistance, because the military assistance got more attention. But actually it got billions, particularly from the US, but also from the Soviet Union. And then from, what was then called the India Aid Consortium, which was an initial issue-based coalition. So we think of these things as new. But it had Germany, France, Japan, and some others, the UK, and I think Canada. But I think what you saw is that these countries actually use that competition for their own benefits. And one can hope that without the kind of downsides, that there will be downsides if this competition intensified, that I do hope that we do see these countries managing to find a way to kind of use this for their own growth and development, and in a good way, not just for white elephants in the middle of nowhere, but for example, especially since you see a more competitive environment, you're not seeing all the major powers actually cooperate, and I'll come to that, and it actually helps lead me into that, the kind of other where you can actually see scope for cooperation. You see these countries now using competition to try to get COVID assistance. Frankly speaking, this should have been done on a global level, and it's not great that that's happening. But otherwise, you would have seen these countries, pretty much ignored or way down the list. So I think, nimble, smaller states, and it's quite. I always kind of laugh when I say smaller states in South Asia because they're so massive. Bangladesh, which you mentioned, is a great example. But I think there is, whatever they can do to kind of stay away from or kind of insulate themselves from kind of this rivalry and try to maximize the benefit for their populations. And also to encourage. Now, one thing kind of the non-aligned world did was try to actually encourage the rivals to dialogue in areas or to cooperate in areas where there were existential kind of problems for these countries. In those days, you found it in terms of kind of the nuclear side, but you're hearing, for example, a number of island states talking about climate change as being one of those areas. Just quickly on the kind of where you can see US-China or India-China cooperate, I think there is still scope for cooperation. One, I think competition is here to stay. So I think the challenge is to manage competition. And I think that can be done. The countries have done it. India, China have done it. The mechanisms exist. They might need to be, I think they do need to be refreshed. But you can manage competition and try to ensure that it does not spill over into conflict. After all, the Soviet Union and the US manages. So I think learning kind of the lessons from there on what can be done. We're hearing some reports that there will be a nuclear dialogue set up between the US and China to talk about some of these issues. And that's one area, kind of nuclear proliferation, arms control. You can see another area would be climate change. You can see a third area being global public health. And frankly, it would help if all the countries got together and dealt with these pandemics. But I do think, there has to be financial stability is another one, just like after the global financial crisis. But I think we have to be realistic that if competition intensifies, it seems to be, you're also going to see competition spill over into these, you'd think, cooperative areas. And I think you're seeing this, for example, in climate change, where in the solar power sector, it's become, countries, India and the US are concerned about dependence on China. There's competitions in terms of clean energy technologies. And you can see it, for example, in global public health. For that matter, you can see it, the countries should have been cooperating on Myanmar and Afghanistan and the situations there. And you're seeing kind of those competitive dynamics spill over, because at the end of the day, the countries actually have a common objective in stability and in terms of stability in those countries, but the competition spills over. So I think, to end on a kind of optimistic, this point on an optimistic note, there is scope to both manage competition and find islands of cooperation, and maybe even expand them. Since since China likes to island build, you can keep, maybe do a little bit of that, reclaim some land reclamation on the cooperative side. But I also do think we have to be realistic about what's possible, and I do think it's important that the price of that cooperation shouldn't be accepting China, for example, doing more island building or changing the status quo somewhere else. I don't think that should be the price of cooperation, because I think that only leads to further instability down the line.
Yeah, no, I think, and we'll end on that hopeful note, because I agree with you. I think there's lots to cooperate on, and hopefully, the rivalry, it's again, you can do talk, fight at the same time, and maybe smaller countries and the people of South Asia benefit from the strategic competition, and their leaders have more importantly, their leaders have the foresight to take advantage of this rivalry for the benefit of their own people, because at the end of the day, it is a relatively poor region with serious needs, and climate change is having an impact already, and it is going to be a hot spot that is going to be impacted by climate change. So I think there's lots of areas for cooperation, and hopefully we don't ignore that. Before I let you go, I always ask my guests, like, what are 3 books that you would recommend to the audience?
So I'll recommend one book that has been kind of influential in my thinking. It's not a book about South Asia, but I will kind of make up for that with 2 books that are more kind of South Asia specific. The book that kind of has been influential in how I think about ideas and particularly policy is a book by Louis Menon called The Metaphysical Club. And it's not really about metaphysics. The book is really about, it looks at how the idea of evolution caught on. And it is a story told through kind of 4 characters, prominent characters in the US, about how the theory of evolution, the ideas existed for years, decades before they finally took hold. And so this is really a book that talks about how and when and why ideas that have been floating around in the ether suddenly take hold. And for those of us who work in think tanks or in the ideas industry, as Dan Dresner puts it, it was kind of quite interesting to me to think about, how to find and grasp those key moments when there's a confluence of conditions that those ideas. So either you try to shape those moments, or it helps you think about taking advantage of those moments to think about impact, to think about how you get ideas into policy. So that's one book, and it's quite interesting. It's not a dry book. It's built around these characters, and you see Charles Darwin puts in an appearance too.
I think I will definitely check this one out, because one of the things I've been wondering throughout this conversation, and just in general as I think about the US-China rivalry, right, is the idea of the Thucydides trap. And how and why did it become such, the core of what we study in IR, if you studied IR or political science, that you always end up studying this, and how this ancient Greek war continues to inform the way we look at great power competition, right? So I think they last for a long time as well once they get introduced as ideas, and people pick them up out of the ether. But so thanks for that. But sorry, go on.
No, and on the kind of history side, there are actually, all these books now about, or papers about the use and misuse of analogies as well, which is the kind of, the associated version of that. The other 2 books are by Indian scholars. One by Srinath Raghavan that didn't get as much attention in his more recent books, but it was his first book, War and Peace in Modern India. I think it was published in 2010. And the reason I mention it, and there are sections on it, including, and it's really a book about kind of Nehru's ideas and the implementation. But the reason I mention it is, and there are sections on India, Pakistan, I think there are 2 or even more chapters on that. But it pushes against this idea of, and at that time it was considered quite different. Now we've seen a lot more of this. It was one of the first books to really use the archival data that was coming out, the papers that were coming out of India, both at the Nehru Memorial Library as well as the National Archives. And he pushes back against the other, that Nehru was this idealist who was kind of a non-violent rejecter of force or the balance of power. And he actually, lays out how actually Nehru did not, as Pakistan knows, as China also knows, as arguably the Portuguese found out as well, that and many of these instances that the China war is covered, the Goa takeover is covered, is thinking about how Nehru thought about the world, the Cold War, Indian foreign policy, but also particularly this idea of the use of force. So I think it's useful in terms of also, hopefully it'll open a door to your listeners to the range of other kind of rethinking about Indian foreign policy that archival data has made open. It'll also makes us rethink some of our assumptions about what India will do or not do in many instances. The second is by Pallavi Raghavan. I guess they are two Raghavans that I met. They're not related as far as I know. Maybe they are. I do not know. This could be a Desi thing where they are. And in a
the Raghavans are like the Patels. They're all related.
But now I'm going to actually check.
Yeah.
But actually, they might be. I don't know. But Dr. Raghavan, who teaches at Ashoka University, wrote a book based on her dissertation, and it's called Animosity at Bay. An alternate history of India-Pakistan relations from 1947 to 1952. And it is a nice departure, but also very interesting. We all, like, when we study kind of India-Pakistan history, the focus is always on kind of the conflict, and especially in 48, or it's about the partition and the aftermath of that. And what Pallavi looks at is, she looks at kind of the state building that both countries were undertaking, and how they actually had to, because the armies were the same, the structures were the same, and how they actually divvied up things, but the engagement that actually took place amongst the two countries and the bureaucrats and the politicians to actually kind of help build their respective states. And so it's just a very different take, covers different issues. The economic, the economic side of it is also covered. So to me, those are the other two books I would suggest. And just since I mentioned the Cold War and how countries take advantage, and perhaps there are lessons in it for kind of smaller states in South Asia. So you get a bonus book, is David Engerman's The Price of Aid, which looks at Soviet and US competition to kind of aid India. I don't necessarily agree with David's kind of view of, he's quite critical of kind of foreign aid, because I actually think you can't blame foreign aid for economic decisions India made. Those were Indian decisions. But it's a very interesting book. Again, it goes back to archival sources from from the Soviet Union, the US, and India.
I'll take a look at that one, because I haven't read this, but I lean, the way you described why you disagree with David, I actually am on his side already, in the sense that, coming from Pakistan and the continuous flow of aid and donor money does impact decision making, and it allows politicians to kick the can down the road. So I'll have a look at that one. But on the book about the early days of India-Pakistan, I until recently did not know that prior to the 1965 war, you did not need visas to cross the border. And people did. And I asked my father that the other day, and he was like, yeah. And I was like, how are we not taught this? So yet the fact, again, thinking about ideas that catch on, the fact that our history, our shared history, has been so dominated by conflict and anger and the brutal traumatic history of partition, means that we at times forget that there's a lot more that is shared even after 1947, because these were young states that needed all the help. And the people who actually migrated from Gujarat or Punjab, or the civil servants from UP, etc., across the border, or from Pakistani Punjab or Sindh, were colleagues, and they had worked together, and they helped each other out in those early days to make sure that their states, because ultimately they were free from colonialism. And we forget that the shared objective was freedom from a colonial power, and somehow we've forgotten that.
We can always agree on blaming the Brits. That is a source of convergence, and may it continue to be so.
I think the World Cup is going on, and today England lost to New Zealand. And I think, yes, on social media, Indians and Pakistanis alike were very happy that our former colonial masters are out of the World Cup. So
I did also see some jokes that England is now probably sitting and cheering for Pakistan.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that one tomorrow, particularly, they might cheer, but let's see. But thank you so much, Dr. Tanvi, for taking out the time. This was wonderful. To those of you tuning in, check out her book and the paper. Links are below, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Uzair.